I thank you very much, and I'm delighted to see you all here. And this is a track in which I was involved more than any other track. And that's partly because I was trying to persuade somebody to organize it who took a long time to say no. In the meantime, I went ahead and did some organizing. And it was a great benefit to me, actually, because this was one track. When I found out somebody was interested in coming to the conference and playing a role, I could invite them to come to this track. A number of them actually fit better in others, so I think there are probably 8 or 10 people who were at one time or another listed in this track as presenters who ended up in other tracks. But I think we've ended up with a fine group, and I'm really looking forward to the interaction and the discussion. And I should say, John Cobb picked up on the mess that I was making and straightened it out and organized it. He really is the track organizer. And I appreciate his giving me a chance to sort of share what was on my mind as I was working on the track earlier. And that will only be in terms of very broad historical sweep. I think that in all of our history of civilization, there have been 3 major centers of power. And I think of politics largely as the analysis of where the power lies. And one of them would be the military political. Those two almost essentially go together. And one of them would be the economic, and one of them would be the religious. And in an imperial system, these 3 are very little separated. That is, if you have enough political power, you will also control the wealth. And if you have both of those, the religion of that empire will be the worship of the ruler of the empire, either directly or very close to a direct relationship. And in many cases, of course, the deification of the ruler is taken for granted. So they don't have to be separate. And in the Roman Empire, and I'm just going to concentrate on this Western history, they were not for a long time separate. The commercial development, where commerce was between one political entity and another, began to develop a somewhat separate center of power. But in the Roman Empire, that was not a decisive matter. The great majority of the trade was within the empire and thus contributed to the strength of the empire. So the one threat to the empire was the prophetic movement of Judaism. And it was, for a long time, the problem was just with the Jews. This was one group who would not accept the idea that the emperor was deserving of supreme, final, total devotion. And they were fussy enough about this that the empire had to make concessions. Even so, these bothersome folk kept revolting until finally they had to ship them all out of the land in which they had been living for a long time and destroy their cities and so forth. In the meantime, Judaism had given rise to Christianity, and Christians constituted, in some views, a nation, a distinct nation. And Christians tried to get the benefit of the exemptions and special treatment of the Jews, sometimes succeeded, sometimes did not, but the persecutions didn't wipe them out. And eventually, power shifted to the church. This was probably the first time in human history that the religious institution became more powerful than the political institutions. But for 1,000 years, Europe was Christendom. And the identification of people was not by their nation state or by their, they would, of course, be very much aware of the village they were from. I don't mean to minimize that. But they did not expect the village they were from to be the comprehensive object of loyalty. So the object of loyalty was supposed to be God, but of course then those humans who represented God were the ones who, in fact, were able to call the shots. You had kings and all sorts of people, but if you asked, where does your authority come from? It comes from God, and the authority was typically mediated through the church. So that were, of course, I mean, I'm not trying to say there was only one center of power through the Middle Ages, but if you say which was more powerful, the church or any particular political ruler, you would almost have to say, in most cases, the church, and the self-identity of most people was as Christian. Well, I say that lasted roughly 1,000 years, and it was a very interesting experiment in human history. Of course, the commercial establishments grew greatly in their power, but around the 14th century, more perhaps in the 15th century, vernacular languages began to be written. And the writing of the vernacular languages put an end to the unique authority of the church as having the language of all scholarship and all writing and so forth, namely Latin. And when a language like German, that as a language, as German, had really not existed, there were hundreds of Germanic dialects. But when you once write it down, you select one, and that becomes the language. And everybody who chooses to read that language has a sense of commonality in the literature that is written in that language. And so a feeling of nationality became strong. And the feeling of nationality contributed to the breaking up of the church, but it also then took over dominance. The Treaty of Westphalia is the symbol of the transfer of primary power from church to state, because there it was decided that each prince or each ruler, political ruler, would decide what the religion of that region would be. Obviously, the church is no longer the dominant factor from that point on. Of course, you can trace this history in England, and it's different from the history on the continent. You understand, I'm making sweeping generalizations that miss by 200 years many events that are important to the thesis. Okay, but then in Europe, the notion of the nation state arose. I think it's really a new notion. You could find some anticipations in earlier periods, but it's not as if this was sort of the way in which political life is organized everywhere and at all times. But France became a nation state. Germany eventually became a nation. It took a long time. It took a long time for Italy to become a nation state. England became a nation state early. Spain became a nation state early. But that became in the minds of people. That became the way the political order should be organized. Now, these nation states were also empires. And of course, they were in no hurry for the people they had conquered and were exploiting to develop their own nation states. But nevertheless, the ideology of the time made the idea of being a nation state the kind of norm, and this inspired revolutions. Some parts of Latin America became nation states, at least in part early. But fast forward to the end of World War II, and by the end of World War II, if you looked at a map of the world, it was all divided up into countries, independent countries, which tried to organize themselves like nation states. Now, for various reasons, this experiment failed. And it's the collapse of the nation state ideal that is the point that I'm most confident of the collapse. Okay, now the collapse took place in different ways. many of the new experiments, the colonies that became countries, were not nations in any sense. The boundary lines had nothing to do with language or any feeling of nationality and identity. They were simply imposed by colonial powers, and the former colonial powers were often able to exploit them to prevent any government from surviving that did not play ball with whatever formerly colonial power was interested. We have witnessed the breakdown of these states that were not nation states and our own important contribution to the breakdown. The case of Iraq, for example, the case of Yugoslavia, the case of Syria. None of these were really nation states, but they tried to organize themselves as if they were nation states. And there's all kinds of difficulties which could be exploited by anybody who had either economic or political interest in that kind of exploitation. A few of the countries that are not nation states, that are multinational states, have survived and are significant players on the world scene. India is the most remarkable. It's very remote from being a nation state, but it is not an empire either. It's a multinational political organization which has begun to generate a considerable amount of loyalty on the part of people to its strange unity. That's a remarkable achievement. I just want to mention it, but it is not typical of what happens in such circumstances. Now, the countries that had been nation states before have eroded in their nation state situation. And here it is because of a massive shift from the political government to the economic order. Now, the economic order has been powerful in nation states for a long time, but the blatant claim to dominance on the part of the economic order is relatively recent. Some of you have read When Corporations Rule the World. That's a book that's been out for a while, but it was recognizing the tide. So it's very interesting that at the end of World War II, on the one hand, for the first time, we had the United Nations, which had divided almost the whole world up into independent nations. They called them nations. They weren't nations, but states. And that experiment made it look like the final victory of the nation-state model. But at the same time, more important than what went on in San Francisco was what went on in Bretton Woods, where they created a different set of institutions. It was much quieter, didn't have the same kind of pizzazz, but those were the ones that were destined to become the dominant factors. So today, we are witnessing not just the beginning of the takeover, but something close to a climatic mode of the takeover of power by the economic order. I have been very interested in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was negotiated in secret, not between governments, but between corporations. I mean, governments were there, but governments were there just to enable the corporate world to do its thing. And in spite of the fact that Congress has not been allowed to see it, majority of senators voted for it. Well, what does it do? It transfers power from nation states to corporate world. And it makes it rather blatant. The most important legal issues that are likely to arise in the future would not be settled by the national legal system. They will be settled by a legal system created to deal with corporate issues. So that a corporation can sue a state in the United States, which has the audacity to try to set wages higher, because this would then reduce the profits of that corporation in its investments there. Well, where would this be tried? Would it go up to the Supreme Court of the United States? No, the US courts would have no jurisdiction. That to me is a fairly blatant form of the transfer of power, and that more than half of our senators would even take it seriously to sign on a blank check, trusting the president. I don't think it had anything to do with trusting the president. It had to do with doing what their orders were, and the orders came from the corporate world, of course. Now, we will be hearing in a little while about Greece. It's fairly clear to me that although I thought that the European community was a wonderful development, I would like to see the sovereignty of nations subordinated to the sovereignty without being removed, but I mean that there would be international organizations that would be able to order the world in a better way than simply national competition, and I thought the European community was a great move in that direction. But I thought when they created a common currency that they had already lost it. The common currency gave enormous power to those who controlled the currency. That means, of course, the banks. And I think at that point, really, power was transferred from state governments to the economic order. And now Greece and Spain and Italy and so forth are good examples of what happens when the basic decisions about life within a country are made by the economic order, and the state is almost powerless to do anything about it. Now, I'm not saying that this takeover is a fait accompli. I think that there are loci of effective resistance. It's always possible that Greece will bite the bullet, become a genuinely independent nation state at enormous cost in the economic, financial, what I mean immediate cost. In the long run, I think it might be better off. But I didn't mean to get into the details, just to say we are right now witnessing vivid examples of what happens in the process of the transfer of power from national government. So when I talk about the collapse, the political collapse, there will be some kind of order that emerges from this. I'm not suggesting that it's the collapse of all order, but what we have understood as the normative pattern of order, the nation-state structure, that seems to be collapsing in much of the world.
Thanks, John. You're a great inspiration to the rest of us. You've done so much, and you're still going strong. So my assignment is to speak on the role of money in the destruction of nations. So I thought I would start out with a quote from Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King in 1935, who nailed it, it seems to me. He said, "Once a nation parts with control of its currency and credit, it matters not who makes the nation's laws. Usury, once in control, will wreck any nation." So I think that just says how money can destroy nations, and that's where we are. It was called usury in the Bible, it was called usury in the Middle Ages, and it was illegal in the Middle Ages. Today it's called financialization. It has a nicer name, and we're actually sort of all guilty of it in the sense that we'd all like our money to be making money without actually having to work for it. But financialization is the attempt to turn all public assets and the commons in general into an asset class that investors can get a piece of. And they do that by interest, which is the conventional definition of usury, by lending money to the government and getting interest, or by outright privatization, where they put governments so far into debt that these distressed governments feel compelled to sell off their assets at fire sale prices, And then so then the privatizers rent it back to us. So they buy our stuff and rent it back to us, or they do it by public-private partnerships where the public bears the risk and the cost of overruns and that sort of thing, and the damage to the environment, and the private interests get the profits. They get their profits guaranteed no matter what. So how was it that we conceded to having our valuable public assets sold off to private interests? It's because we've been plunged into debt, and that was done by sleight of hand. We were sold a bill of goods, more or less, on what our money system is. Henry Ford said, allegedly, I'm not sure that, I've never seen it in writing, but supposedly Henry Ford said in the 1920s, it is well that the people do not understand our money and banking system, or there would be a revolution before morning. So what he meant was that governments do not create our money. We've been told that our money is issued by governments. You would think that because the coins and the dollar bills have pictures of presidents and kings and queens on them. But in fact, it is banks that create virtually all of our money. So they create it and they lease it back to us. And that was at interest, of course. And that was so there have been various money reformers like Henry Ford who have been aware of this for over the last century. In fact, Dr. Daly, who we'll hear from tomorrow, is one of them who's been aware of this and exposing this basic fraud on the people. But lately, it's become so obvious, largely through the internet, that they can't really keep suppressing this information anymore. So a year ago, the Bank of England came out with this rather amazing 4-page paper. It was part of their quarterly report that said, contrary to popular belief, banks do not lend deposits. What they lend, they actually create deposits in the process of making loans. And that 97% of the British money supply comes in this way. In other words, it's just created by banks on their books when you go to the bank to take out a loan. So, and you don't need savers. We've been told that you have to have the savers first, and then we borrow the savers' money. So people put their money in the bank, and then the bank lends that out. But that's not what happens. The bank creates those deposits. All they need is a credit-worthy borrower. I mean, there's certain restrictions on how much they can create. I heard it, I can't remember the woman's name, but it was one of the women that started one of the people that started the whole derivative explosion in the late 1990s. And what started it was that they had this like multi-billion-dollar loan for a bank in Europe, and it was a good bank, and they were pretty sure that they'd get their money back, but it was so much money that they just couldn't really risk it without selling off the risk to somebody else, and that's how they devised this derivative scheme. But she was just acknowledging that they were just writing a check for this huge amount of money that they did not have, and that they didn't even have the capital for it. And they actually were using derivatives in order to get the capital, like, just the 10% or whatever that you had to insure. So they're basically conceding that all they're doing is when you go to the bank to take out a loan, they basically are turning your IOU into money. And that's what money is. It's IOUs. So there is no limit to the number of IOUs you can have. It's just like a community currency where you can have as many exchanges as you have people willing to give and people willing to take with credit and debits. But in a community currency system, that is a public system. And so this whole system would work if the bank itself were public, or if banking were a public utility. But in fact, what we have now is banking there's a monopoly on it by private banks, which they're in control of who gets the credit. They get a big tribute from every loan. They create our money, and they want as much again back. Like if it's a 30-year loan, they want as much again in interest as they put out in principal, and that money's just not there. So where is that money going to come from? Somebody somewhere has to take out another loan. So what you have is this unsustainable pyramid scheme where you just have to keep sucking in borrowers at the bottom in order to sustain the lenders at the top until the whole thing explodes. So you've got your bankers in control of who gets the credit. They get very cheap credit, and they're making a lot of money off it. So it's like a parasite that's always sucking money out. Whereas you could have another model, and historically there have been there have been very good public banking models. So historically, you've had two systems vying for dominance. You could go all the way back to Sumeria, which is the first historical civilization, first written civilization. So I guess it's considered the first historical civilization. But I'm not sure how much time I have. But I'll just go back as far as the American colonies, so the American colonists issued their own money. So that was a publicly issued monetary system. It was a brilliant system. They didn't have gold. There weren't many banks around, and the Bank of England was charging high rates of interest. So it started when the governor of Massachusetts had to engage in a little war, and he didn't have the money for it, and so he just started issuing these paper receipts that were basically an acknowledgement by the community that service had been performed and that the whole community agreed that they would use these receipts. I mean, they traded among themselves, and what gave them value was the fact that they were accepted back in taxes. So what they really were an advance against future taxes. So you might think it was a debt of the government, but it wasn't. It was really an advance payment by the people to the government. So you could use these little chits when your taxes were due and you got some sort of premium like 20% or whatever. So you actually made money by advancing the taxes early to the government. But in the meantime, you had the private system in England where the Bank of England was issuing the money of the country. It's complicated how they got that power. But again, it was basically a fraud. I mean, they were purportedly issuing their own banknotes, which were promissory notes for gold. But they only kept about 10% or less, I think, of the amount of gold that they had outstanding notes, because they quickly discovered that you could lend many more times the notes that you had than the gold to back them, because everybody wanted to trade the notes. Nobody really wanted the gold because it was too inconvenient to carry around and it might get stolen and so forth. So the colonists, so King George forbade the further issuance of paper scrip when the Bank of England was quite alarmed that they were losing economic control of their colony, and the colonists rebelled, and we had the American Revolution. But for complicated reasons, we won the war, but we did not retain the power to issue our own money. We wound up with a private banking system like the Bank of England. But that was very unstable because they were issuing many more notes than they had gold. And then, so in 1913, we got the Federal Reserve, which was supposed to backstop all these bank runs that they had periodically all through the 19th century, which obviously didn't work because we had the biggest bank run in history in 1929. But meanwhile, in Australia, there was a public system. In 1912, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia was established, which actually was a publicly owned bank, and the governor of the bank realized that he could just issue credit, that he didn't have to borrow it from anywhere. He didn't have to borrow it from the Bank of England. So he issued this credit to rebuild the country, basically, and also to fund the participation of Australia in World War I. And it worked brilliantly well until he made the mistake of going to England and bragging about it. And in the City of London, he said that the Australians could have whatever they could imagine. All they had to do was issue the credit for it and, in other words, pay for it with their own credit, and then whatever it was they built would pay the money back. So you'd advance it first, and then it would get paid back. And he died rather suddenly of a heart attack after that. And the Bank of England then organized this new system where central banks, up till then, it was the Treasury that would issue the money directly. But under the new system, the central bank was supposed to issue the money and lend it to the government. And at the head of the apex of the system was the Bank of England, of course. So in this way, they planned to retain control over their colonies economically that they had lost politically. But then there were various defectors. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand did what Australia had done quite brilliantly until they were suppressed by the Bank of England. And the Bank of Canada did it that in 1939, or 39, I think, it became a public bank, and for the next 35 years, they funded roadways, seaways, all sorts of development, their healthcare system, their social security system. It worked really well until 1974, when the big banks regained control through the Basel Committee in Europe, where the new rules were that the central banks were supposed to maintain the value of the currency, or maintain the, something like the stability of the currency, which meant that governments were not supposed to issue their own money or borrow interest-free from their own central banks, but they had to borrow privately. The theory being that when you borrowed from a private bank or from private lenders, you were borrowing existing money. But in fact, as we now know, you're borrowing money just created by the bank either way. So you're obviously much better off borrowing from your own bank interest-free, which would save a lot of money for countries. And the way we were sucked into that was that we had a period of stagflation then, which was blamed on governments issuing their own money, but that really wasn't it. It was the fact that the price of oil had quadrupled due to, well, Henry Kissinger supposedly met with some big bankers in Sweden in 1973, and they agreed that they would back the dollar with oil now that it had gone off the gold standard. And they did that by quadrupling the price of oil through this 9 days war that was kind of, just a little something, but it caused this whole embargo that, remember when we were all standing in line, we got locks on our gas tanks and stuff. And so the price of oil went way up, so all the countries thought they had enough dollars for their reserves, but they didn't, so they had to borrow. They had to borrow from the big U.S. banks. And there were several other factors that drove up the prices. One was that, it was cost push. In other words, one was that labor was strong then, and so they were pushing up their wages, which pushed up the costs. And then interest rates were lifted supposedly to limit the amount of currency, but what it actually did was just drive up the costs of businesses. So anyway, costs went up, blamed on the governments printing money. So we wound up with all the countries being in debt as they are today because of this whole system where governments can no longer borrow from their own central banks or issue their own money. But the solution, as I'll just read from what William Lyon Mackenzie King said after that first sentence. The solution is to go back to what the American colonists did and what the Commonwealth Bank of Australia did and what the Bank of Canada did until 1974. He said, until the control of the currency and credit is restored to government and recognized as its most conspicuous and sacred responsibility, all talk of sovereignty, of parliament, and of democracy is idle and futile.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Ellen, for setting the stage on this whole predicament. I've been asked to talk about the Greece situation specifically. And first, I'd like to preface that with a couple comments. There are many ways to issue exchange media. And we need to think beyond money and think about exchange media. The tax foundation for currency is only one of many. There's also the goods foundation, and there's the foundation of anything that's valuable that's traded in the market could be used as the basis for issuing money. So we have had history of many private currencies, voucher systems and so on, that have been able to circulate as money. One of the cases that I point out on my website, reinventingmoney.com, is the case of Canadian Tire Money. Canadian Tire Money was offered as a rebate to Canadian Tire customers. And they have a chain of retail establishments all over Canada. They don't sell just tires, they sell all kinds of things. Anyway, when you go to a Canadian Tire store and you buy something, they give you maybe a 2% rebate in the form of, well, it used to be in the form of voucher notes called Canadian Tire Money. And then you could, on your next purchase, turn in that Canadian Tire Money and get that much off the amount that you owe. So there are stories about people paying for taxi fares and other things using Canadian Tire Money because lots of people like to shop there and they know that the company is good for it. So that's just one point. The other point that John made was the shift in power away from nation states. And I'll have a little bit to say about that in this presentation. But basically that's what we're up against today, is nation states are losing their relevance in the order of things. Alvin Toffler spoke about this, 40 years ago now, when he wrote the book, The Third Wave. And he said that power would drain away from nation states. He didn't go into great detail about where the power would reside after that. But let me continue with the Greece situation. This has been in the news a lot lately, and I just want to give you what I've learned about it recently. First of all, a little bit of the factual background. This one slide I got from one of the publications that uses Reuters news service, and it shows basically the level of debt that Greece owes and also the amount of their gross domestic product, which is supposedly a measure of total economic output. So according to this chart, they show that the national debt to GDP is about 177%. I did some further research and found some other information about this, and I don't know which one is more reliable, but I think I got this from the CIA website, so you can judge accordingly. So their national debt, according to this source, was $346 billion. Excuse me, that's euros. You have to add about 15% to that at the current exchange rate between the dollar and the euro to get dollar amounts. And the GDP, 176 billion. So that's almost 200% of GDP that they owe. Now, this is a country of 11 million people. It's not a very large country at all. And that's why they're facing the problems that they are, because they have been exploited to a great degree by getting in debt to the transnational financial organizations, the Troika as it's called, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the World Bank, and also private banks in Germany and elsewhere. So in contrast, the United States, you can see the debt to GDP is about 105%. That's still very high, and many economists say that once you reach a level of 100% of GDP, you're on a slippery slope to oblivion. The fact that the United States happens to be the center of the global empire may retard the collapse here for a little bit longer. But we're going to see a domino effect. Many countries are going to go the way of Greece. It'll be followed by Portugal, Spain, Italy, and others. We've already seen troubles in Iceland and Ireland. They've had some temporary recovery, but I think at great expense. So I talk about the 4 R's. What they need is respite, reduction in the amount of debt that they owe, recovery, they need some time to recover, and they need to restructure. Ultimately, it's only restructuring that's going to solve the problems. So the immediate problem is Greek government is insolvent. They have a crushing debt burden that needs to be managed, Right now, the news is full of information about the negotiations between the Greek finance minister and others in the Greek government with the Troika and with the German banks. And Angela Merkel, who's the Prime Minister of Germany, is taking a hard line and not wanting to give an inch. So it's becoming increasingly worrisome that no agreement is going to be made, and in which case there may be what's called Grexit, Greek exit from the Eurozone. But I'll talk about that in a minute. So they need to negotiate repayment terms. They need to issue domestic currency that will circulate in parallel. And Yanis Varoufakis, who's the finance minister under the new government, actually made a proposal to that effect last year. And he has a website, actually a blog. If you Google Yanis Varoufakis, you'll find it. And I made a comment on that site to his proposal for a parallel currency. What he's proposing is basically tax anticipation warrants. Ultimately, I think it may come down to the Greek government having to pay pensions and employees and other creditors with their own tax anticipation warrants while they try to rebuild their economy and generate greater liquidity. So in the long term, they need to develop a strategy for reviving their economy and resolving the political and economic dysfunctions. I've been doing a lot of research lately because I'm headed to Greece in about 4 days, actually next Tuesday. And I've been there twice within the last 3 years, working mainly with grassroots people, and I'll be talking about that in a minute, who are actually working to create liquidity outside of the banking system. But one of the sources that I've found that gives me some insight into the Greek mentality and the Greek political and economic situation is this particular item here by Aristos Daxiadis, forgive my pronunciation. He says, rebuilding the Greek economy will require creative interaction with the underlying realities of Greek society. And he goes into detail in his article talking about the family, small enterprise, the habits of rentocracy, that is people trying to get a bit of something for nothing, and the low level of trust and also opportunism that prevails. Now, what John was talking about earlier and what Alvin Toffler alluded to many years ago was the erosion of national sovereignty. Right now, what we're seeing is sovereignty being surrendered upward to corporations and supranational institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, the World Bank and the IMF. Basically, it's the banking cartel and global elite that controls this whole mechanism. Alternatively, we could move in the other direction and hopefully get our governments to cede sovereignty downward in a democratic form to empower people to create what I call the butterfly society. And a keystone in the butterfly society is creating mechanisms of private exchange, including private currencies, as I gave the example of the Canadian Tire money, but issued on a different basis, not as a rebate, and credit clearing networks, which I have been writing and talking a lot about, and you can find out all you want to know about that by looking at my website, beyondmoney.net. I've given many presentations on that particular subject. So Carol Quigley told us a number of years ago exactly what is going on, and Ellen has used this quote as well in some of her presentations. Carol Quigley, by the way, was one of Bill Clinton's mentors at Georgetown University Foreign Service School, and Clinton had high praise for him. Quigley wrote this book in 1966 called Tragedy and Hope, where he outlined basically the historical emergence of this power elite. And he said the powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching plan. nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Now that's a pretty tall order. But their secret is that they have annexed from governments, monarchies, and republics the power to create the world's money. And that's what Ellen was talking about a little while ago. And I also elaborate on that in my book, The End of Money and the Future of Civilization. So this is what we're up against, and this is the challenge that we're facing. How do you confront a power like that that has spent decades accumulating power by having control of the money system? Whoever controls the money controls everything else. And if you're able to control and create the money out of nothing, not exactly out of nothing, but then you can buy politicians, you can buy Congress, you can decide who's going to be the next president. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking Republican or Democratic, the government still follows the same basic agenda. So if we finally face a situation where Greece has to leave the Eurozone, then they're going to have to do some debt triage. You know, when a corporation faces bankruptcy, when they recognize that they're insolvent and can't pay all their creditors, they go to the courts and they look for bankruptcy protection. There's a whole set of bankruptcy laws and regulations that govern this process. And basically, a judge will help figure out how to restructure this company financially, who's going to be paid, who's not going to be paid, how much the debts are going to be written down. So I'm saying that what I would like to see the Greek government do, ultimately, in either case, is to decide the same question. Now, the first segment would be what they owe pension funds, municipalities, schools, employees, and other individuals. The Greek government needs to be faithful to their people. So these debts should be honored in full. However, there's always shenanigans that go on within governments, and so there needs to be a process for public approval so that the ones that have been sort of under the table and illegitimate can get weeded out. Then the next third would be legitimate obligations to non-bank corporations and other entities. Now, in a bankruptcy situation, what happens is you freeze the amount of the debt. There is no further accrual of interest. So this is very important. Otherwise, you're never going to get out of the hole. If you don't freeze the amount of the debt, there's no way you're going to be able to pay it back. So you freeze the amount of the debt, there's no more accrual of interest, and you work out a stretch-out repayment plan. But this needs to be capped so that you don't put undue hardship on your people. And this is the problem with the austerity measures that have been imposed on Greece heretofore. The bankers, the creditors don't care. They just want their pound of flesh. And if the Greek people have to starve, so be it. And finally, the third segment is the obligations to banks that have loaned money that they created out of thin air, and the supranational institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the European Central Bank. These could be repudiated, in my view. So what would the government do long-term to resolve the problem and restore its economy? First, I would recommend that they choose decentralization and subsidiarity. Subsidiarity means letting the lowest level of institutional government handle the problem. So if it can be handled at the local level, let it be at the local level. If it requires regional or state level solutions, then so be that. They also need to reduce controls, regulations, and taxes that interfere with small enterprise and impede creativity and self-reliance. I would argue that if we do institute private currencies and local credit clearing exchanges, the government should relax all taxes and regulations on that kind of activity. They should support market-based approaches to innovation in not only the exchange of value, but also in finance and economics. They should be protecting the commons, and especially the credit commons. You know, this is one unrecognized aspect of the commons that we really need to pay attention to. Every political currency collectivizes our credit. They need to enforce the contracts, and they need to gain public support by participatory budgeting and approval of the kinds of taxes that are going to be levied on the people. These are the references that I mentioned. This first one here at the top is probably the most important one. This Aristos Doxiadis happens to be a venture capitalist, but he wrote this article in 2010 where he outlined the real Greek economy, and I would recommend that to you. Another book that I happened to find by accident in a bookstore in Tucson was the 13th Labor of Hercules, and this gives tremendous insight into the origins of the Greek crisis, but also into the underlying mentality and structures in Greece. And the third one, The Global Minotaur, was written by the current finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, who's an academic. He's taught at the University of Texas in the United States and elsewhere. Now, among the things that I pulled out of these references were the fact that small-scale dispersed ownership of land and business is characteristic of Greece. And that's part of what makes Greece so charming and why it attracts so many tourists. But it's also, I think, one of its strong points in surviving this crisis. It has more self-employment than any other country in Europe, 57% according to that first source, self-employed or employed by companies under 10 employees. Small business is still the prevailing form of organization. Self-employment, micro-employment, and family business is a stable and fundamental institution in Greece. And families invest in real estate and education. This is also characteristic of Greece. When children are educated, they might get an engineering degree, but they don't necessarily go to work for a large company like we do in the United States or in other parts of Western Europe. They might be involved in the family business, and if there are no jobs available, that's a good fallback for them. Also, there's been a low level of foreign investment. Outside of the debt, this has been a real advantage because now you don't have a lot of exploitative economic activity going on with foreigners drawing resources out of the country. As far as the mentality of the Greeks is concerned, it's very individualistic or familistic, if you will. It's neither obedient nor cooperative. That's a quote from the first source that I mentioned. There's a zero-sum mentality. They don't see that cooperation can actually increase the benefits to all. There's a culture of opportunism and a sense of entitlement. There's one quote in one of these sources about when they were negotiating for money from the European Union, one person said, well, let's get the money and we'll decide how to spread it around. One of the things that has historically been done in Greece is post-dated checks. This is a primitive attempt for Greek business people to create additional liquidity, and that's something that we can build on in creating new ways of providing homegrown liquidity outside of the banking system. So when I go to Greece next week, one of the things I'll be doing is helping to organize solidarity circles and payment alternatives among small and medium-sized businesses. One of those efforts will be in Crete, another will be on the mainland up north in Volos. This is an example of one of the credit clearing exchanges that I've been involved with. I've been there twice in the last 3 years. This is called the Volos TEM. TEM is a Greek acronym for something I won't try to say, but it's basically a mutual credit clearing exchange where people buy and sell amongst themselves, and instead of using euros or some other currency, they simply keep a record of debits and credits. When you sell something, your account is credited. When you buy something, your account is debited. So it's just a fluctuating account balance. So my prescriptions in general, and this is my concluding slide, in order for national and regional economies to thrive, they need to get out of debt in whatever way they can do that. They need to reduce competition with other economies, withdraw from what has been called the race to the bottom. They need to invest in local infrastructure and enterprises. They need to reduce dependence on imports and export markets. This is what Jane Jacobs called import substitution, that is producing more for local consumption and less for export. They need to enhance opportunities for local exchange, and they need to increase the local value added and then monetize that value added through credit clearing exchanges or private currencies. So I'll stop there. Thank you.